All right, so today we are touching on imaginary numbers. We're learning what imaginary numbers are. So remember last class, what did I say is imaginary? Right, when you have a negative in a what? Inside of a square root, right? Why do you think that is termed imaginary?
Because squares can only ever be positive.
Right. Why can square roots only ever be positive?
Because negative times the negative.
Right. So when you're asking yourself, so if I have a square root and say it's the square root of 4, what do you ask yourself to find the square root of 4? What times itself is 4? So if I'm asking myself what times itself is a negative 4, what's wrong with that?
Because you have to have two different.
Right. What is 2 times 2?
4.
And what is negative 2 times negative 2?
4.
Both of those are a positive 4. Can a number times itself ever equal a negative number?
No.
That's why they created an imaginary number. So, I stands for imaginary, is actually equal to the square root of negative 1. So what do you think I squared is going to be? Yep, what is negative 1 squared? So what is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1? What is that going to be? So let's think of it this way. What is the square root of 4 times the square root of 4?
16. Oh, wait, never mind. 4.
Ah, a square root times itself is just what? The number inside of the square root. So what is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1? Negative 1. So when you square an imaginary number, what happens? It becomes no longer imaginary, but real. That is why they created eyes, right? You're thinking to yourself, why the heck are we caring about something that's imaginary? We care about it because eventually in our problem, we may end up with a real answer. So they created imaginary numbers as placeholders. Kind of like, oh, in the meantime, just in case our problem could end up actually having a real solution, we'll put a placeholder of I in there. Because eventually, if you square I, what happens? You can think of I as like a placeholder. That's why they created imaginary numbers. All right. So, we're going to do a couple of examples. Why are you not erasing? Erase. Oh my gosh. There we go. Okay. So, here. What is the square root of 144? How do you know that? Right, you ask yourself what times itself is 144? Well, 12 times itself is 144. What also times itself is 144? Negative 12. So this is actually plus or minus 12. So, next part, if we are trying to simplify a square root, what do we do? What can I do here? I can simplify the radical, yeah. I can split this actually into 2 radicals. I can split it into square root of negative 1 times the square root of 144, right? That still is the same thing. I just simplified it a little bit. Split it into 2 radicals. So what is the square root of negative 1? It's what? I. So I can replace that square root of negative 1 with I. And what's the square root of 144? So this is actually just 12i. Done. So next, I have 360. Oh, did you get it? It was 12i. So here, 360. What can I do to simplify 360? Let's do, I showed you the factor tree, right? Let's just do the factor tree. For those of you still confused how to do this in your head, let's factor tree this. So, what two factors go into 360? So, 360 is divisible by 10. 10 is a factor of this. 10 and 36. What can 10 be split into? 2 and 5. And what can 36 be split into? And what can 6 be split into? And 6 again. All right. So do you remember how to do this? Where are our pairs of numbers? Good. I have a pair of 2's, so I know I'm going to write a 2 on the outside. And I also have a pair of what? 3's. So I'm going to write what? 3 where? Outside. And what are our leftovers? 5 and 2. Where am I going to write those? Inside my square root. So what does this simplify to? Wonderful.
Can we simplify that by dividing it by 2? Or do we leave
No, you can't. It has to stay like that. All right. So now, this is now negative 360, the square root of negative 360. What do you think is the only difference? There's going to be an I in my answer. Where do you think I'm going to put? So I replaces what in our problem? The square root of negative 1. So is I inside of a square root anymore? No, it's going to be outside of our square root after the 6. The reason we don't write it after the square root is because that could sometimes be confused with me saying the square root of 10i. The I is outside of the square root, so we put it after the whole number. Okay, last one. Here we have negative 12i squared. What do you think happens here? We learned that when we square I, what happens? Yeah, the square of I is negative 1, right? The square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is just negative 1. So this is now negative 12 times what? Negative 1. What is 12 times negative 1? I'm sorry, negative 12 times negative 1 is done. Any questions on I? All right.